is to pull together what you already know into one place so they get one good picture to reflect on. Most importantly, listening to Professor Raphael in the morning, actually, at a point I told him, look, it was like we sat together and then you told me, Kofi, do this, and I'll do this. What am I saying? What he presented is actually a precursor to what I'm going to say. The only difference is that I've put mine in a context. And again, all the other speakers have alluded to some of the things I'm going to say in terms of the challenges and how we approach the challenges and solve them. So they've made my work a lot easier. Like they say, he who laughs last, laughs best. Right. Again, the repetition is not much of a problem because sometimes repetition is good. Why? Because it reinforces the point, and that is very important. Okay. So again, I need to apologize. I didn't really understand the context or the construct of this meeting. So I prepared my presentation in a typical academic kind of structure where you attend typical conferences and the way you present your materials is totally different, from what I perhaps should have done here. But you don't need to worry about that. I'm going to be as general and as conversational as much as possible. Okay, so just in case I run out of time, I need to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to do so that if I run out of time, at least you have an idea what Kofi was going to say. So in my introduction, I'm going to talk about a general picture. I'm going to give you a general picture of the harm at sea problem, the presence of distant water fishing nations in the Pacific Island country waters, and then the fleets and the countries involved. And then the background, I'll describe the rights violation issue, the abuse, the nature of the abuse, the victims and perpetrators. And I'll go on to talk about the factors driving the harm at sea in the PICs, the cases of harm at sea in PIC waters. I'll take a few country-by-country specifics and narrate them as they are. And then I come to specific country challenges where I pick the country which I call my second home, the Solomon Islands case, and try to share that with you. And then I'll conclude. Another thing I need to point out, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a regulator, so typical of my profession, what you're going to see is what is the issue, who is involved, what are the causes, and the figures. So it's essentially, that is typical of my profession. The only thing I've left out here, as far as my profession is concerned, is the pictures and the graphs and all that kind of stuff. But the figures, you see them. All right, so we know that the rights issue, it's not new, right? In the industry, especially on high seas, and we know that distant water fishing companies, it's a new phenomenon. It's something, old, dating back decades of years ago. Now, who are the real, victims? We're talking about the crews who are exposed to a litany of abuses, insufficient food and water, physical and verbal abuse, human trafficking, etc., etc. We know all this. These are stylized facts. The problem permeates all facets of the industry, and solutions not focused on occurrence at sea alone is very, very important. Oftentimes, we tend to lose sight of the fact that, it is not only at sea that the harm is. It's not only at sea that the abuse is. The abuse is even on land. And we see a couple of those references here. What is the attraction of these distant water fishing vessels into the region's waters? Is the richness and the wealth of the resources in the region. The PIC waters entice fleets from distant fishing nations due to the abundance of stock. Name them, Abaco, Big Eye, and so on and so forth. And I think Perry is here and Francisco is here. You can correct me if I'm wrong. The last time I checked, the stocks are healthy and they are not in danger of depletion. Okay. Again, distant water fishing nations are they're major players in the region, in the PIC. But I'll be using the word PICs and region interchangeably, so please understand me in that context. So, estimated these DWFNs are estimated to account for about 86% of the tuna caught from the region's waters, and that is huge. All right. So typically, the distant water fishing firms in the region have devised a strategy to use flux of convenience to keep access to resources in the region's waters. For example, Taiwan firms, as of 2021, had one of the highest numbers of FOCs, vessels, operated by its own nationals. Now, again, I'm not indicting any country per se. This is just an example, and this is what it's out there in public domain. So this is not an indictment on any country. So these distant water fishing nations prefer bilateral to multilateral relations. Why? Because it's easier for them to deal with the bilateral nations than dealing with the regional members like the FFA group, because they are more stringent and they will require stronger rules and regulations to apply with. Well, I see Francisco already shaking his head, but that is that is something that we can come to later. But at least, as far as I know, that is what the literature said, right? So, since 1982, Taiwan personers and longliners, pole and line vessels are those vessels that operate the regional waters. But typically, you have the longliners who, are said or reported to be the most offenders when it comes to, acts of violation against crew. Again, let me be very clear here, because I heard Francis at some point saying that, there's the incorrect information that crew are killing people. And I think Professor Raphael made a very important point, that we should be able to define who is a fisher and who the companies are. In this case, we're talking about the companies or the vessel owners that exploit the crew. It's not the crew against crew. In other words, it's not a fisher who is actually doing the fishing against a fisher on the waters. And that should be very clear. So another means of guaranteeing access to the resources is by operating vessels under chartering arrangements, because that makes it easier for them to access the resources. Again, this is not new to you, most of you here. Just to give you a bit of perspective on the area we're talking about, is huge. And if you look at the countries involved, these are, archipelagic countries, small countries with, islands spread all over the place. So it makes a management challenge, even to see what is going on. I heard Perry say, observers, you could be in the observer room, looking at the screens, seeing what is happening. But even if it is real time, there is nothing you can do, because the EZ is huge for all the countries. Besides, if countries like New Zealand and Australia were not in the region, actually it would be disastrous, because these small island countries do not have the resources to monitor, to control, and to surveil. Okay, so what is the background? Human rights violations at sea and compromised crew welfare are global. We know that, and it's been said here, over and over this morning. Illegal fishing presents a case of profound human rights abuse, social cost, and environmental injustice, particularly in vulnerable developing countries, vulnerable developing nations, and worse for all, when you're talking about small island archipelagic countries. That is a huge challenge. In the Pacific Island countries context, vulnerability of crew and long crew on long-line fishing vessels include trafficking, forced labor, abuse, violence, and other crimes. Crews are sometimes offered drugs to keep them awake in order to increase productivity. Trafficked crews working as slave laborers are threatened to be thrown overboard at sea, sometimes murdered for non-compliance, because he or she, well, usually he, was trafficked. He didn't know that he was going to go into, a ship to go and fish. So they can be resistant and decide not to comply. The report out there, it's not me saying that, is that they can be thrown of the vessels. And that is in itself a crime. So, who are the victims? The victims are not the crew alone. Observers. There have been reported cases of observer murder. There have been reported cases of even some captains, being killed. Okay, we'll see examples of this, as I go through the slides. Harm at sea is also a serious challenge to food security and economies of many developing nations, on developing coastal nations. You see, when we talk about harm at sea, and like I said this earlier, we only think of the crew out there. It does not only affect the crew. That's, of course, the primary problem. But, the effect on nations, the effect on coastal communities, it's also a crime. Because they deny them of food. They deny the countries of resources that they need to use to develop the nations and to take care for their people. Perpetrators of harm at sea are not IUU fishers alone. We often think of IUU when we think of crime at sea. But, again, research out there shows that vessels fishing legally also commit these crimes, and it's significant. For example, cases have been reported in New Zealand. I think Francisco is here. No, these are reported cases. So this is not only for, illegal fishers. Even legal fishers do commit these crimes. Why am I stressing this? I'm stressing this so that when we are trying to find solutions, we don't look in only one direction. We look in a broader perspective. And I think I've made that point somewhere on the slides. Okay, what are the factors driving harm at sea? And like I said before, typical of my profession, what is happening, who is there, what is causing that? Hence the structure of my presentation. The harm at sea is exacerbated by cost saving, and I think Professor Raphael, talked about this. He was asking, what are the incentives? What are the motivations? These are the incentives. These are the motivations. Cost-saving incentives, rent-seeking interest, harmful subsidies from wealthier nations. Professor Francis and I were talking about there. When someone raised the issue of coastal fishers not even having ice to preserve their catch, why are we not using part of those subsidies to help such? A lot of the subsidies are harmful, and the information available says that about 35.4 billion per year is which forms 63%, is categorized as harmful subsidies. Without subsidies, 54% of DWF activity is economically not feasible. Okay. Now, reaching distant waters is so expensive that fishing fleets resort to cost cutting. We've heard this over and over. Typically, and require state subsidies and cheap labor to turn a profit. Without that, they can't do that. And I think, again, Professor Raphael, was asking a lot of these questions rhetorically when he was making his presentation. These are some of the causes. These are some of the incentives. These are some of the, push factors, if you like. Industry competition and huge capital outlay for most firms in fishing industry make labor in the industry an obvious choice for cost saving, which unfortunately comes with attendant labor exploitation and rights abuse. Now, Again, we continue with the harm factors. Labor costs is estimated between 30 and 50%. Imagine you're, running a business where your labor cost, shows the concentrated area of, expenditure. Obviously, that is where your, management effort would be to try to make sure that you become profitable. You have to reduce costs there. I think it was Francisco who showed that, up to 1980 something, the fleets in the waters were double what it is now. But amazingly, the hooks in the waters is actually more than what it used to be there. While they're cutting down the fleets, but increasing labor and forcing labor to do the work that many fleets would have done. Technology, he said, hasn't changed much. But why the number of hooks increasing? So these are some of the measures they take in order to do what? To cut costs. A typical example is what I show here. PIC Waters is the case of 111 men out of 113 migrant workers on 5 fishing boats working with no contracts, but still had to pay recruitment agents on a regular basis. In fact, someone said that, and I don't want to mention the writer, it's a researcher who says that, fishers on vessels earn decent wages. Let's assume that is true. What is decent about earning a wage for which you are treated like a slave? What is decent about the wage for which you are treated, with less dignity as a human being? I don't see the decency in there. So people go in there, yes, they want to have decent living, but they are treated, like nothing else. And Francisco again was saying, some crews earn $450 a month. That was a very nice scenario, even given the low wage they get. If you look at the kind of work they put in there and what they get, that is low, but at least that is stable. And you may call that, because they are giving holidays and all that, you may call that fairly decent. That's fine. But how about those who are not paid and yet required to pay the recruiters? So whatever they are getting, the captains will not give them, they already give it to the recruiters. You might be on the vessels for a long time and you come home with nothing. All right. So cases of harm at sea in the waters. The literature and media reports on distant water fishing and illegal fishing are replete with cases of inhuman treatment of seafarers in South Pacific tuna industry. For example, this guy reports that cases based mainly on data on China and identifies hundreds of offenses committed by Chinese flagged vessels between 2015 and 2019, detailing a range of human rights abuses and environmentally destructive fishing practices. So these things are happening in the waters around here. Cases of abuse, assault, murder involving crew aboard these vessels are reported in many of these countries. We'll see details as we go along. So here I'm giving you some country-specific, challenges, cases, if you like, that have been reported in the literature. It's not me saying this. And again, this is not, let me repeat, it's not an indictment of any country. It's just putting the picture out there so that we would appreciate the enormity, the degree of the problem. In PNG between 2010 and 2017, and this is reported by Human Rights at Sea 2022. This is a huge document that I have to say to look through and to summarize in this form. So 4 reported cases involving crewmen and observers, including murder, missing in quotes, and poor health conditions. Who are the victims and the forms of harm? 1 case of murder of a PNG national on Philippines flagged vessel. 1 missing case of a Federated States of Micronesia citizen on Taiwan flagged vessel. 1 case of a PNG national on an unknown flagged vessel. 1 case of death of a Kiribati citizen resulting from hypertension while on Taiwan flagged vessel. You might think that hypertension is natural. Yeah, it is. But something can cause that. It can be either because you are naturally not well, or it can be because that you are coerced into certain conditions, or it's because you are under certain conditions that will say that. I am not saying that, the vessel owners or the captains intentionally caused them, but you can do something to drive somebody into that. There are obvious cases resulting from causes. So these are obvious cases resulting from causes and forms of harm to crew, and these are not these are not just stories being made up. These are reported cases. In fact, we talk about data. The problem with it is that, it's difficult, and I think Professor Raphael asked that question several times. Why are these things not reported? One, they're way out there. Who is in charge over there? Is the captain out there? Even the victims themselves, some of them don't report because of fear of stigma. There's a case that happened in Solomon Islands a couple of years ago, where one of the victims was an observer, a lady. And, she found it difficult to come out to actually describe or detail what was happening. So there are a lot of challenges that shroud the occurrences in secrecy. Solomon Island waters, between 2008 and 2018, cases involving crewmen. One case of murder involving a Fijian national on a China-flagged vessel. 3 cases of crew, that's Fijian, Filipino, Indonesian nationals, falling overboard while on Taiwan-flagged vessels. Again, I'm not insinuating, and I don't think the reporters are insinuating that these guys were intentionally pushed overboard. But because of the reports we hear, because of the things we've been made to know, we can assume. Because if you can make a mistake and fall overboard, right? But, you could also be pushed. One case of death of Indonesian national resulting from septicemia after assault on Taiwan-flagged vessel. The last time I checked, I'm not a medic, but septicemia is a kind of infection of the blood. So if you've been injured and you've had no treatment, no medication, obviously, you get infection that can affect, and this is talking about what? The conditions on the vessels, the conditions at sea. Fiji waters, between 2010 and 2018, cases involving crewmen, captain, and chief engineer, observer, included death, poor health conditions, disappearance, and murder. And the victims and the forms include death of a captain and a chief engineer on a US flagged vessel, death of a Fijian national on an unknown flagged vessel after suffering from pneumonia. Yes, we know the nature of the weather out there, and we know the nature of the work they do. The last time I came here in April, we visited the port. If you saw the storage facilities, the amount of, ice, the freezing conditions in those storage facilities, and these guys, some of them are bare-handed. They go in and bring the fish out, then getting pneumonia. It's some of them, they even have gloves. They don't have any protective gear. So it means that, and they are forced to do that, because you don't do it, it's considered non-compliance by your captains, and you get all sorts of treatment. So we can say that those are some of the treatments, conditions on board. A Fijian on an unknown flagged vessel falling aboard. And I think it was Perry who mentioned that some of the vessels, are not even identified. And because of the vastness of the environment, of the oceans, sometimes it's difficult to tell. So if somebody has been trafficked and he's not recorded, he's not identified, he's as good as not living, because anything can be done to him or her. And that happens a lot. So 3 crewmen of unknown nationality missing on an unknown flag vessel. Okay. So I combine these, three countries together because their cases were few and I couldn't separate them. So I put them together. So it's Tuvalu, Palu, Marshall Islands, four of them actually, and narrow waters. Between 2010 and 2020, reported cases of death, murder, drowning, abuse involve crewmen and observers. And I said earlier that the victims are not just crew. The victims include, observers. And in the previous slide, you saw that actually even captains and engineers were involved. Whatever happens for which an engineer or a captain can be killed is another story. But that tells you the degree of and the enormity of the danger out there. If a whole captain can be murdered, if a whole engineer can be murdered, then who are you, a common crew? Okay. So the problem is bigger than what we think. So the victims in the form include two separate cases of murder involving two Chinese nationals on Fijian flagged vessels occurring in Tuvalu. And let me make this point. And I think Sumela said that some couple of years ago, that oftentimes when we hear about China, we think China is the worst perpetrator. It's not the case. It's just by the sheer size that we assume. But you can see that even their own nationals, Chinese nationals, are affected by some of these issues. Okay. In Palau waters, two separate cases of death resulting from accident. We don't know the kind of accident. Involving crewmen of Chinese nationality on a known fishing vessel. Sorry, on a known flag vessel. In Marshall Island waters, 3 cases of crew death. Chinese national on US and Taiwan flag vessel died through helicopter crash with a Persian vessel. I can't just figure out how that thing happened, but it happened. Again, it's a question of safety issues. 2 separate cases of drowning of PNG and Kiribati citizens on Taiwan flag vessels. In narrow waters, 2 separate cases of murder and abuse involving observers were reported. A PNG national on China flag vessel and a Kiribati national on Taiwan flag vessel in 2017. So this are some of the, the reported cases. I don't want to call them facts. I don't want to use the word facts because some of these are quite anecdotal. Why? Even the victims don't want to talk about them. So it's quite difficult. And we've talked about, in all the presenters, from Professor Raphael to the last person, talked about data. Without serious research to really get, verifiable data, it will be hard to solve these problems. And I think, was it Perry? He said, okay. No, I think, again, Professor Raphael, when he showed the case of Mr. Bean, okay? It happens, you go to the court, the police call you, you have to have a proof. In this case, they don't have any proofs. So what happens? Human beings get lost. And the statistics were given. In developing countries, it's 1,000 per 1 million, right? And that is serious. In narrow waters, 2 separate cases of murder and abuse involving observers were reported. A PNG national on China flagged and Kiribati national on Taiwan flagged. Okay. Now, these are very recent cases reported by Dr. Patricia Kailola. We happen to share some work. So she shared this report with us. This is a report that she and another colleague, documented, and we also gave her some work. So, this information out there that can be verified. So all these, the cases were physical abuse, employment deception, wage theft, and all those. These crews were deceived into being taken abroad for work. They ended up on Chinese farms. Okay, and so when you're talking about deception, some of these cases, out of time, I'll just skip through this, but these are some of the cases that we see in the trade. The country challenges, I'll just talk about Solomon Island briefly because I'm out of time. In Solomon Islands, first human trafficking and sexual abuse case involving minors as young as between 9 and 11 years were first reported in 2017 by American Bar Association. In Solomon Islands, children are exploited in multiple locations, including beaches and on fishing boats. Note, it's beaches and fishing boats. And they know, and the peak seasons are when they know that the ships are going to come. So you see, it's not happening only out there, it's happening on land as well. Okay? Children are forced, transacted by family members for monetary and material gains, and so on and so forth. Why am I bringing all this? You see, we should look beyond what is actually happening out there. We should look, what are the push factors? What will force someone to sell his or her own child or a relative for monetary gains? So the cases go on and go. Poverty, illiteracy, school dropouts, and so on and so forth. The good thing, though, is that the country itself is doing something, making the effort. But as we see in the last in the last slide, you realize that it's not the question of individual country effort. Because the small countries can try, but there's an extent to which they can go. So there's a need for collective effort to solve the problems. So on Friday, just before I was flying out, I was fortunate enough to be invited to the launching of 3 strategy documents that the country is trying to look at, strategies to help address some of these things, at least internally, working with state, different state agencies and all that kind of stuff. Law agencies, the DPP, that is Director of Public Prosecution and all that kind of stuff to solve this. So they're making the efforts. But the question is, how far they're able to go. Okay, conclusion. Debate. So a lot of all the challenges and the solutions my earlier colleagues who presented have, reported on them. They've said everything. Let me just add these few ones. Debate over reforms in fisheries governance in developing countries should redirect focus on a broader view of human rights in the lives and livelihoods of crews and fishing communities. A broader perspective, including the establishment of frameworks that adequately protect victims and safeguard their interests at national, sub-regional, and regional, be adopted. In PICs, members of the regional body, FFA, and I think Perry said a lot, they are trying. The HMTCs, instrumental in adoption of, the FFA is instrumental in the adoption of non-binding resolutions, and so on and so forth. These are efforts. These are good enough. The fact remains that more effective and coordinated enforcement is required. And I think one of the speakers, alluded to that. It's required at national, regional, and international levels. As Ryden puts it, she argues that the fragmentation of the efforts, remember I just said that the countries are trying on their own, but she says that the fragmentation of the efforts and the difficulty of dealing with the issue in a coherent and holistic manner dwarf individual country efforts, signaling the agency to adopt concerted global approach to addressing the problem. Binaka level.